नमस्ते दोस्तों, आपका गोल्ड प्राइस टुडे न्यूज में स्वागत है। और आज हम चर्चा कर रहे हैं सोने चांदी के भाव की। और इसके लिए हमने खास तौर पर चुना है मेटल्स फोकस के लंदन के एमडी मिस्टर फिलिप न्यूमैन को। ये इंटरव्यू हमने अंग्रेजी में किया है, हालांकि मैं आपको इसकी कुछ खास बातें हिंदी में बता देता हूं ताकि आपको समझने में दिक्कत ना हो। दोस्तों, फिलिप न्यूमैन का मानना है कि हम जो है अभी रेट कट साइकिल में, जैसे आपको मालूम है कि फेडरल रिजर्व वहां पर दरों में कटौती कर रहा है। इनका यह मानना है कि इस साल और अगले साल दरों में और कटौती होगी। अगले साल की शुरुआत तक इनको लगता है कि सोने का भाव $3,000 तक जा सकता है और चांदी का भाव करीब $38 तक पहुंच सकता है। जब मैंने इनसे पूछा कि क्या सोने के भाव में करेक्शन आएगा, तो इनका यह मानना था कि ईरान इजराइल युद्ध पर आपको नजर रखनी चाहिए। अमेरिका में जो फेडरल रिजर्व दरों में जब कटौती करेगा तो उसकी लैंग्वेज क्या होगी उसको देखना चाहिए। साथ ही मुनाफा वसूली, इससे भी सोने का भाव नीचे आ सकता है। इन कारणों पर नजर रखनी है। इसके बाद मैंने इनसे पूछा था कि अमेरिका में ट्रंप या हैरिस किसके आने से सोने चांदी के भाव में तेजी या मंदी आएगी। तो इनका यह मानना है कि चाहे ट्रंप आए चाहे हैरिस आए, अमेरिका में कर्ज बढ़ेगा और ट्रंप के आने से ये जो डेट है वो ज्यादा बढ़ सकता है। इससे अमेरिकी ट्रेजरी पर दबाव पड़ेगा और इसी कारण वहां पर सोने के भाव को सपोर्ट मिल सकता है। हालांकि इनका यह भी मानना था कि अगर कमला हैरिस आएंगी तो उससे भी तेजी में आएगी, पर उतनी नहीं जितनी ट्रंप के आने पर। जब मैंने उनसे पूछा कि फेड की तरफ से क्या अगली बैठक जो 7 नवंबर को हो रही है उसमें ½ % रेट कट की उम्मीद है, तो इनका मानना था कि उतनी उम्मीद नहीं है। चलिए दोस्तों, मैं आपको मेटल्स फोकस के लंदन के एमडी मिस्टर फिलिप न्यूमैन का इंटरव्यू सुना देता हूं। Hello, friends. I am Virendra, and today we have a very special guest on our show, Philip Newman, Managing Director of Metals Focus in London. Philip, welcome, and a very happy Diwali to you from all of us.
And, very happy Diwali to you and everyone who's watching this as well. I wish you health and prosperity.
Yeah. So, Philip, in our last interview, you projected gold would reach around $2,700 and silver 35, both targets that have been achieved. So, what do you foresee next?
Well, that's a very good question. You're absolutely right. So obviously we caught up at the India Gold Conference. And I think at that time, gold was literally just breaking through $2,500 an ounce. And in spite of what we thought was quite a bullish forecast, if I'm honest, we perhaps didn't think that gold and silver would reach those highs quite as quickly as they did. So I think if we take each in turn, and I think it's really, many of the themes that we spoke about have really carried on. The floor that the gold prices experience is very strong, lots of solidity there, lots of credibility around that floor. And that's allowed the price to really build on those levels and to really continue to hit these new highs. So I think it's the fact that, as we know, that the Fed is continuing most likely to reduce rates. So we're into that rate cutting cycle. Expectations of further rate cuts this year and next year, which is reducing the cost of carry in gold, is attracting investors. We've seen the pressure on the dollar. That's also been gold supportive as well. And then there are other factors, unfortunately, the ongoing escalation in the Middle East, those tensions there, the uncertainty, what will happen, I guess, primarily between Iran and Israel. Everyone's waiting to see now how Iran will react and what it will do. So that contagion and what that means for perhaps even inflation, if the oil price was to spike, what does it mean for global trade, which is still to some degree, recovering from COVID. So I think there's lots of reasons out there. And I think something else that we are looking at is the sort of the asset diversification argument. We look at the record highs that US equities have achieved. And if you're an investor, an institutional investor with, say, 4 or 5% of gold in your portfolio, and this is how your equities are generally behaving, well, that encourages you to go out into the market to acquire gold, just to make sure that you do maintain gold at that, say, 4 or 5% level. Um, and I touched on the floor and how important that is. Well, we've seen central bank buying continue. Not at the levels we saw the past couple of years, but I think that was unreasonable to expect it to remain at those levels because they were record high totals we saw from the official sector. But by and large, it has remained present in the market. And I think that's also part of really helping to ensure that floor, that gold price floor or support is very strong in the marketplace.
So what are your targets for the 2020-25?
Oh gosh. Well, we have, for gold, we do think that early in next year you could see a peak of gold in dollar terms of 3,000, which is really quite staggering. Such is the interest that we see in the market from institutional investors. And I think there's also an element, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it still holds true. This fear of missing out. Those investors that perhaps were skeptical that gold would not just reach the levels that we see today, but it would hold onto them. And so, I think, corrections are likely. I think they're quite healthy in the market. When you are in a market where you're seeing this kind of bull run, and the price never moves in a straight line. The buying momentum can dissipate. You can have corrections, but I think any correction will be short-lived, partly because I think there's a considerable amount of money on the sidelines waiting to come into the market. And I think that could drive prices higher to maybe, as I said, that $3,000 handle, which is really quite staggering. I've been in the market for 30 years, and I still remember when gold was below $300 an ounce. So to talk about reaching 3,000 is really quite amazing.
And silver?
Silver is really interesting. A lot of volatility there. We saw it get up very close towards the $35 and in really short order. So there was a lot of movement there. Because it is, as I said, it's a much smaller market. So a lot of volatility. And so, when it did get up to those levels, we saw for the first time in quite some time, the gold silver ratio just tiptoeing below the 80 level. I think it's back over there as we're talking today on the 28th of October. So it's be a really interesting one to watch. I think, one of the reasons, if we can just briefly put a bit of context around silver, one of the reasons I think it has struggled in a relative sense compared to gold in the context of thinking about the gold silver ratio is concerns about the Chinese economy. What would those stimulus measures that were announced fairly recently have much of an impact? And I think some people in the market were quite skeptical about that. And I think that was certainly has weighed on silver. I think what we're seeing now, or the past couple of weeks, is that with gold, getting through 2,700, some investors have thought, well, for the short term at least, maybe gold has reached that peak. Let's maybe turn our attention to silver. So I think you've seen some positive spillovers from gold into silver, hence that ratio coming down and silver coming up. What does it mean for the price? Really difficult to call. Could we getting up? If we're thinking of early next year and gold is at $3,000, well, maybe that suggests that silver could be $2 or $3 higher than it is, 37, 38. But again, it's such a volatile market, and it is quite a challenging one to call.
You said there will be a correction. So how much and when?
Well, that's a really good question. It's hard to say when. I think it's something that there's all sorts of factors that we could have that could cause that correction. It could be that you have a relative easing of tensions in the Middle East. If Iran, for example, and this is just pure speculation on my part. If Iran comes out and decides that it's not going to retaliate, that could help ease those tensions to some degree. Um, we've seen the Fed pricing in. I think the markets are pricing a 25 basis point cut at the next meeting. We'll see what language it talks about. Maybe it'll be concerned about a degree of not overheating, but a fairly strong US economy. This isn't to say, of course, it's going to change course, just to be really clear, but maybe it could temper the rate or the pace rather of rate cuts. And then, the fact that gold has done so well, maybe the upward momentum or that upward strength we've seen loses some momentum, and some investors decide to book profits. So you could see gold, could it fall, towards the 2,600, perhaps even just below. But that is really quite incredible to think that the floor is that high is, I think, quite amazing. And it goes back to my earlier points about the fear of missing out, the money on the sidelines, the rate of central bank buying as well. And again, just how strong that floor is.
So, Philip, one more question about US election. There are reports that if Trump wins, he might raise tariff, which could increase inflation and put pressure on Fed, might be on a rate hike side. In your view, how could this impact gold prices?
Well, that's a very good point. I think before we get to the tariff question you raised, which I think is a very entirely valid question, I think the markets are watching both parties in terms of their policies they put forward. I think whether it's Harris or Trump, it would see US debt rise. I think the independent view is that the debt would rise more under Trump than Harris, and so that in itself could be when we think about the pressure or that what I mean for US Treasuries, that would be, I think, gold supportive. And then to your point, do we see some of that positive sentiment towards gold unwound because of what it means for in terms of tariffs? It'll be interesting to see what does that mean, not just in terms of inflation, but also growth, not just in the US, but further afield. So I think there are certainly a lot to consider, but I think it's a very good point. If we see those tariffs put on to the extent he says, a lot of people are skeptical that while tariffs may rise under a Trump administration, he may be reined in to some extent by his administration. And so maybe the impact on inflation won't be as great as the headlines make at his speeches at the moment. So I think I'd hang fire a little bit in terms of the Fed. I still see it maintaining its course for the foreseeable future. And so overall, from our point of view, as it stands, we would think that under both administrations, it should be gold positive, of course, to varying degrees, depending which one, whether it's Democrat or Republicans in the White House.
And what about China? As Mr. Trump in his former tenure, there are some trade tariffs and trade something like that happened. And how do you see China, if you want to answer this question? Because yesterday I was seeing a report of China Gold Association, and they said there are the consumption of gold decreased in the China around, I think, 11% or something. So how do you see that scenario?
Okay. Well, I think there's a few things to unpack there. If you go back to the beginning of the year, the first few months, Chinese demand was exceptionally strong for gold, be it retail investment or purchases by the central bank. We've obviously seen, pauses by the central bank so far in terms of, they haven't added to the allocations. So that's, I think, has been quite interesting. And we've seen, I think, retail investment weaken. We've seen the market move from, quite a decent premium at the start of the year. And last time I checked, which is a good few days ago now, but the market was in a discount. I don't think either of those Well, I think especially the retail investment hasn't got anything to do with the US administration. Um, so, but if Trump comes in, you perhaps, I think it's obviously related to the tariffs you've spoken about. You have more saber rattling. Could you see an escalation of the trade war between China and the US? That could really unsettle markets. That in itself could see a correction in equities. And I think that could be gold negative from a general point of view. In terms of specific buying within China, I think one of the reasons that some elements are struggling, particularly on the jewelry side, is because the economy, there's a lot of uncertainty there. And so again, that could take potentially looking forward to next year, there is a risk that could take a hit if as I said, if you've got a Trump administration and you do see, not just saber rattling, but an escalation of tensions between the two countries.
Okay. So, Philip, my next question is about the Fed meeting as you spoke. Is there any chances of 0.5 rate cut again surprise?
I don't think so. I think they are. I think what's priced in is most likely you've got two more meetings. You've got one just after the election, one in December. The markets, I believe, are pricing in a 25 basis point cut at each. And I would suggest that, they would, I think that's where they're going to be heading. As I said earlier, there are indications the US economy is still running quite hot, quite strong. And so I think they will, maintain their rate cuts because that's what they said. So that's their guidance. But I would be surprised personally if at either meeting it goes beyond 25 basis points.
And can you tell us about that silver squeeze? There are lots of talks and articles and discussion around silver squeeze. Could you share your insights on this?
Sure. Well, I guess on one level, I understand it because, if you look at our figures on the market for global silver demand versus supply, we have the market in a very strong deficit. We've had it for a few years now. And so that has meant a drawdown of stocks. But then at the same time, if you think about this year, and in the Western markets like the US or Germany, which are two of the heavyweights when it comes to retail investment of silver, both are struggling. Um, and in somewhere like Europe, I understand, a lot of the supply chain is certainly not short of silver. I think the silver stocks are quite elevated. So I don't really see much sign at the moment of a silver squeeze. I think if you look at holdings on the CME, they're quite decent, or vault holdings on the CME in New York. If you look at what's going on in terms of the LBMA, those holdings are also quite, they've edged down a little bit to the latest data, but they're certainly considerably higher than they were in January of this year. So, I think, on one level, yes, we have the market in a substantial deficit, and that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. But then, if you speak to the supply chains on the ground, as we try and do on a regular basis, I think quite a few of them aren't particularly short of silver either.
So my last question, what happens if Kamala Harris comes?
Well, again, her policies will still see US debt rise. So that will still be gold positive, not to the same extent, as I said earlier, as Trump. But so I think that's something to watch out for. And I think there'll be perhaps more of an element of stability. So that could maybe help ease tensions in several jurisdictions. Uh, I appreciate that when she was vice president under Biden, her profile wasn't that high, but I would still feel that people around the world feel she's, a fairly a known quantity. Looking at the tone of her rhetoric and her speeches, over the past few months. So I think that would maybe, what's the word, cool the temperature of some of the rhetoric. So that from that element, that could be gold negative. So we shall see overall.
Yeah. In the last, anything else you want to share about gold investment, silver, or anything you want to say?
Not especially, as I mentioned, from the silver point of view, retail investment is really quite weak at the moment, but it's been interesting to contrast that with the ETF space. There's been some interesting movements there. So that's something that I think is really quite interesting in terms of the different dynamics within the silver market. And we'll have to see how that plays out. As I said, we've still got the market in a deficit. We will be presenting our latest findings on silver market on the 12th of November when we present at the Silver Institute dinner in New York. But at the moment, it does look like the deficit will still be quite considerable this year.
Thank you so much, Philip. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.